International Standard ISO IEC 20000-1 Information Technology Service Management. Hi friends, I welcome you all here at TNB Academy. Today we are going to talk with you about the clause 4.3 determining the scope of the service management system. In this session, we shall cover all the requirements of clause 4.3 determining the scope of the service management system in detail, along with appropriate examples for your convenience, as the requirement of the clause 4.2 depend upon the requirement of clause 1, scope of standard, and also clause 4.1 and clause 4.2. I would like to recommend you referring clause 1, scope, and clause 4.1, understanding the organization and its context, and clause 4.2, understanding the needs and expectation of interested parties of ISO 20000-1/2018. Also, for better understanding of clause 4.3. So please go through clause 1, clause 4.1 and clause 4.2 of this standard, which will indeed help you understanding the documentation requirements at later stages. Let's discuss now about the outcome of this session. After completing this session, you will be enabled to understand and verify the implementation of the requirement of clause 4.2 of the ISO 20000-1/2018. You will learn about the interested parties that are relevant to the SMS and the services, and will also learn about the relevant requirements of the interested parties. Before starting clause 4.3, let me explain you in brief ISO 20000-1/2018 standard. The ISO 20000-1/2018 standard provides organization with a set of requirements for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving a service management system, SMS. Organization can utilize the guidance in this standard as a framework on how to successfully manage a SMS. In September 2018, ISO 20000-1/2018 Service Management System requirements was updated to address the growing needs and challenges in the delivery of IT management. Now, we will discuss about clause 4.3, determining the scope of the service management system. The requirements of clause 4.3 of the standard are determining the scope of the service management system, SMS. The organization shall determine the boundaries and applicability of SMS to establish its scope. When determining this scope, the organization shall consider A. The external and internal issues referred to in 4.1. B. The requirements referred to in 4.2. C. The services delivered by the organization. The definition of the scope of the SMS shall include the services in scope and the name of the organization managing and delivering the services. The scope of the SMS shall be available and be maintained as documented information. Note 1. ISO IEC 20000-3 provides guidance on scope definition. Note 2. The SMS scope definition states the services which are in scope. This can be all or some of the service delivered by the organization. Here, an important point to be needed if we are talking about mandatory document and retention of documents. Under this clause 4.3, the scope of the SMS shall be available and be maintained as documented information. The organization must establish the scope of the service management system by determining the boundaries and applicability of the service management system. While determining the scope of the organization must consider and external issues determined in clause 4.1, the requirements of the relevant interested parties in clause 4.2, and the products and services of the organization. Requirements from ISO 20000-1/2018 that can be applied by the organization shall be applied within the scope of the SMS. Requirements from this international standard that cannot be applied by the organization and which does not affect the organization's ability or responsibility to provide product and services that meet the conformity of its product and services and enhancement of the customer satisfaction. The organization must make available the scope and must maintain scope as documented information, stating the product and services covered by the SMS and any justification where a requirement of this international standard cannot be applied. Determining the scope of the Service Management System (SMS) has been a part of the ISO 20000 requirements for a long time. This scope is a vital part of the SMS as it defines how far the SMS extends within the company's operations and details any exclusion from ISO 20000-1 requirements and the justification for these. It is through the scope that you define what your service management system covers within your organization. With the release of new update to the ISO 20000-1 requirements, ISO 20000-1 2018, there is some additional clarification on defining the scope of the SMS. These clarifications will help you standardize how companies define the scope of their SMS, even if they choose not to have a service manual, which is no longer a stated requirement in the standard. Section 4.3 of the standard details the requirements for determining the scope of the service management system. In a note about SMS, it is stated that the SMS can include the whole organization, specifically identified sections of the organizations, or one or more function across a group of organizations. To start, there are three considerations to be included when determining the scope. 1. External and internal issues that is relevant to the purpose of the organization, the strategic direction, and the ability to achieve intended results. Second, requirements of relevant interested parties. Third, the product and service of the organization. In addition, the scope is to include any information of the ISO 20000-1. The scope is to include any requirements of the ISO 20000-1 standards that can be applied, and if a requirement is determined to not apply, entire organization. Some noted exceptions are when your SMS only the organization will not use this as a reason for not ensuring conformity of product and service. The scope is to state the products and services covered by SMS and justification for any instances where the ISO 20000-1 standard cannot be applied. It is most common that the scope of the SMS covers one physical location of a multi-location company, or when your manufacturing or service is distinctly split between industry. So, your scope should identify the physical location of the SMS, products or services that are created within the SMS processes and the industries that are applicable if this is relevant. It should be clear enough to identify what your business does, and if not all parts of your business are applicable, it should easily identify which parts are. Now, coming to an important aspect of the standard. Practice writing non-conformity under this clause. I would explain you the process of writing non-conformities. Before that, let me tell you in short what exactly is non-conformity. Non-conformity refers that the organization is not fulfilling of the requirements of one or more provisions of the clause of the ISO 20000-2018. Non-conformances are most commonly uncovered during verification, inspection, or testing activities. If your test finding reveals misalignments in your requirements, that's a non-conformance. Non-conformity may be of two types: minor non-conformity and major non-conformity. Let me give you an example here. Techno 5, based at Bangalore, India, is a company which is involved into manufacturing of earthing electrodes and marketing, trading, contractor, service provider for IT solutions, power solar components, security automation solutions, authorized service center in Mumbai and Delhi cities. During the ISO audit, it was found by the auditor that the company could not produce the relevant documents covering the following points as mentioned in their clause 1. Scope document of the standard. 1. License from concerned government department to manufacture solar cell and other components. Since the company mentioned in their scope that the company is manufacturing solar components like solar cells or solar panel, etc., they must have legal clearance from the concerned government department, though company is actually buying the solar components from third-party company and not manufacturing themselves. In this scenario, since company could not produce the government license for solar components manufacturing, it comes under major non-conformity, though they are fulfilling the needs of customers. Second, the mailing address details of physical authorized service centers in Mumbai and Delhi cities. Since the company has no physical service centers and using only the personal contact addresses of the technical executives in Mumbai and Delhi cities, it comes under major non-conformity. Now, let me explain how to write a good non-conformance report. To achieve the main goal of effectiveness non-conformance report, you should follow some guidelines, which I am describing in detail one by one now. First guideline is to describe in detail the issue that caused the non-conformance. The responsible person for operating the non-conformance report should provide details of the issue that caused the non-conformance, including the who, what, when, and where of detecting non-conformance. This description needs to be clear and understandable, so the non-conformance can be investigated correctly if needed. Second one is to include the requirement not being met. You must note the requirements that the organization has not fulfilled, so you ensure that the responsible person for addressing the non-conformance understands the exact requirement that is being violated. The more specific you are about the issue, the more effective corrective actions will be. Some examples of requirements not being met can be client requirements, ISO standards, regulatory requirements, etc. Third guideline is to create an action plan to carry out the necessary corrections and corrective actions. This is probably the most relevant step, since the action plan contains the instructions on how to overcome the non-conformance, and if you perform it correctly, you will be able to reduce consequences of a non-conformance, and minor issue will not grow into a major problem for the organization. Depending on the depth of the non-conformity, two different approaches are possible: performing only the corrections or also the corrective actions. Corrections are the activities that deal only with the consequence of a non-conformance. For example, if an internal audit did not take into account the whole scope of management system, and then the correction will be to perform an additional internal audit that will cover the whole scope. Corrective actions go a step further from corrections. They analyze the cause of the non-conformance and they will focus on eliminating the cause in order to prevent the same problem from happening again. Using the same example of the internal audit, the root cause could be that the internal auditor was not trained properly, or that the person who had defined the internal audit program was not informed about the required scope. In principle, the decision to open a corrective action will be made if non-conformity significantly affects the achievement of the goals of the management system. Subsequently, it is necessary to integrate the responsibility and actions to be carried out with the non-conforming material or service that originated the problem. For example, return of product to supplier, reprocessing of parts, agreeing on new conditions with the customer, etc. Fourth guideline is to verify the closure of the action. You need to include in the non-conformance report the results of the actions taken to solve the problem. In case the non-conformity has not been solved after carrying out the planned actions, another report should be opened with the details of the original non-conformance. And the last guideline is to monitor and measure NCRs. Non-conformance reports are input of the management review and they are key part of the continual improvement of the system. You can group this non-conformance report by different elements such as origin of the non-conformance or date, and analyze these data to obtain paramount information for the continual improvement of the organization. I hope these guidelines will help you in writing an effective non-conformity report for your client organization. Now, let's discuss what are the common mistakes auditors do while ISO audit process. Some of the common mistakes made by auditors while auditing are: putting questions which are irrelevant for the organization. Sometimes auditors start thinking for the option, while auditors need to understand the client process and to decide if the client can achieve the result of the management standard system through their own process. Auditors start expecting those documents and records in clause wherein this may not be mandatory. Auditors impose their opinions without facts. Auditors report findings but don't provide evidence. Auditors stick off checklists without considering the bigger picture. Auditors believe the paperwork and ignore the facts. Auditors feel obliged to find error. Auditors allow cost cutting to staff the audit. It is highly recommended that being auditor, you should avoid these common mistakes while doing ISO audit to make it effective. So friends, now we have reached at the end of the session. I hope you have an idea about the clause 4.3 determining the scope of the service management system of ISO IEC 20000-1 2018 Information Technology Service Management Standard. Dear friends, we have now come to the conclusion of this training session. See you soon with an exciting new topic. Till then, goodbye.